Now, many of you probably know that CIS has been engaged in the great public policy debates over many decades, from economics, education and health, to culture, to Indigenous affairs and international relations. But we haven't really done much in the field of energy policy. That's largely because it is a complicated niche issue and we just don't have the policy expertise, and there are so many crowded markets involved with respect to the energy debate. So today we do hope to make amends by having this exchange on a very important issue that has so many consequences for our way of life and our economy. And I thought, what better way to start proceedings than by quoting from a Financial Review editorial yesterday. And it seemed to me that this was quite relevant to the issues that we'll be discussing today. The headline is, "The energy transition is flickering as renewables struggle to catch up." And it quotes Daniel Westerman, and of course he is the Australian Energy Market Operators Chief Executive, and he says that coal-fired power is leaving the system faster than renewables are being built to replace it. To which the AFR replies, "Urgent investment is needed. The energy transition is faltering." And they go on to say the choice between meeting the 2030 target of 80% renewables and keeping the lights on might only be a few years away. The penetration of solar and wind and the overall need to decarbonise the economy is undermining the economics of coal-generated power. 3 big coal-fired plants are scheduled to close this decade, but the Snowy 2 hydro scheme is way behind schedule, as is the massive investment in transmission lines needed to connect the national grid to far-flung solar and wind generation. The Financial Review editorial goes on to say, thousands more wind turbines and hundreds of thousands of solar panels are needed, plus massive investment in transmission and gas peaking power. Yet, the approvals for new projects have stopped, mired in quicksand. Financial Review goes on to say, producers of gas, the critical transition fuel, are demonised. Victoria has excluded gas from the safeguard mechanism that is supposed to provide reliable backup, particularly on windless nights. The Financial Review concludes, BP, one of Australia's biggest energy investors, said this week that renewables were approaching their own sliding doors moment where they could not meet future targets. Never has the message to keep all options open seemed more sensible, yet the rapid developments in affordable nuclear power overseas cannot even get a look in. So that's the Financial Review editorial this week. It was published on Wednesday, June 21, 2023. And that is a great way to introduce our panel, and I'll introduce each person one at a time. Felicity Wade leads the Labor Environment Action Network. She works for the World Resources Institute in Washington. And for more than a decade, Felicity ran the Wilderness Society in New South Wales. Please welcome Felicity. Stephen Wilson is Adjunct Professor in the School of Mechanical and Mining Engineering at the University of Queensland. He's also a Director of an energy startup. Please welcome Stephen. Stephen Galilee has been the Chief Executive of the New South Wales Minerals Council since 2012. He's also a Senior Advisor to Prime Minister John Howard and also to the former New South Wales Treasurer Mike Baird. Please welcome Stephen. Stephen, I'll say Stephen Wilson, Stephen Galilee, because we've got two Stephens on the stage. Stephen Wilson, how do you account for the fact that in 2023, coal, gas and oil, the 3 fossil fuels, we're heavily dependent on the fossil fuels in the world, and there's only something like 5%, maybe 6% that's renewable for energy use. How do you account for that, given all the investments and subsidies that go towards renewables?
I think the first thing we have to realise is that it's easy for renewables to partially displace things like coal and gas in a power system, but to fully replace them is very, very difficult. And so the other thing we need to realise is that when you look at the whole globe, in Australia, energy growth has been sort of slow to non-existent on the main power system, although other forms of energy have been growing. But when you look at the world and you look at places like India and China, growth has been very strong for most of the last 20 years, and just the scale and rate of deployment of renewables has struggled to keep up. These are resources that are trying to convert very diffuse, very low density, intermittent energy forms into the highest grade, the highest value energy form, i.e. electricity. And that takes huge amount of materials, resources and land. So there's some of the reasons.
And if we look at the Australian numbers, the Energy Department data makes this very clear when it comes to domestic energy consumption. The last available figures are 2020, 2021. Gas, 27%. Oil, 36%, coal, 29%, renewables, 8%. Felicity.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to point out that this is a transition, and transitions are hard. And of course, the obvious analogy is that when we shifted onto coal, the Industrial Revolution, it was no straightforward, easy picture. We are dealing with the fact that we have to retool. We have to have massive technology innovation. We need to learn by doing. And of course, really importantly, we have to move a whole bunch of legacy and vested interests out of the way. And I think it's really, it's a salient point that we talk about subsidies for renewables. The gas industry has had huge subsidies across time and are yet 4 times more expensive. Gas is 4 times more expensive than it was a decade ago, unlike renewables where the cost curve is dropping very quickly. The other thing I would really like to say at this point, which I think shouldn't be lost in this debate, is that this is not actually about just an argument about hippie power versus old power. This is the future of a safe climate. I think the Paris Agreement, the science is clear that emissions are continuing to rise for all of this talk, to your point about, renewables is still a small part of the mix. And if they continue to rise, then the temperature will go up, the fires will continue, things will get hard to live in. So it's not just a sort of a technology versus technology argument. This has actually got this other huge existential challenge.
And just keeping with the local situation, Stephen Galilee, we all too often hear politicians, particularly the Energy Minister Chris Bowen, past guest here at CIS, talk about lower energy prices. This is one of the benefits, cheaper energy from the transition to renewables. Why then are we now in a situation where power prices are increasing and warnings from the regulators and others of possible future power supply shortages here in New South Wales and Australia? How do you account for that?
Thanks, Tom. This is the existential question in this whole transition, and it is a transition for sure. And renewable energy is cheaper if you just calculate at source when it's generated, but you've got to get it to people who want to use it. We are seeking to replace our entire energy system with a new one, essentially, and we're doing it on a timeframe that's been set by politicians that know little about this issue. And it's being done way too quickly. We're not learning any of the lessons of what's happened overseas. No country has done this successfully in any other place around the world. Yet here we are rushing headlong into arbitrary targets and arbitrary timeframes that are crashing into the reality of what is possible. So we have here in New South Wales and more broadly across the country, an electricity system that it was working for a long time. It was getting a bit old, and there's issues in relation to the emissions that it generates. We're seeking to completely replace it with new forms of energy in that very, very fast time frame. And it's running up against the reality that you can't do that in the time that that's been set. You can't install 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines across prime agricultural land without farmers, surprise, getting a bit upset and now being offered up to $400,000 a kilometre to build it. You can't install the thousands of football fields of solar panels that are going to be needed to generate the electricity that needs to replace what's being taken out of the grid way too soon. And you can't put offshore wind farms off the coast with, surprise, without communities getting upset about that too. I mean, these are the issues that our industry have been going through for a long time whenever you propose a new mine. And it shouldn't come as any surprise to anyone that doesn't matter what sort of development it is, people get upset if it's pushed through too quickly and without the right consultation. So, you said in your introduction, Tom, quoting the Fin Review, the sliding doors moment is coming. Well, it's here. It's here now. The reckoning is now. I mean, we need to decide, and governments need to decide, are we rushing this thing too quickly? And if we do, is it going to fall apart, and is community support going to fall away? Or are we going to slow down, get it right, and make this transition work? And my view is, the governments are going to have no choice than to face reality. It's good to hear some truth-telling from AEMO in relation to this, because for far too long, we've had the people that are supposedly the experts responsible for mapping out the pathway of this transition spending too much time talking about it. It's too much time at conferences and, dare I say, speaking on panels, rather than actually fixing the problem. So the reckoning is coming. The reckoning is here. We all want to be part of a successful journey on this. But if it's rushed, it's not going to work. It's going to be a disaster, an economic disaster, a community relations disaster, and it's going to have social and economic impacts far beyond what anybody can imagine.
A reckoning is coming, but if you speak to a lot of people coming out of high school, and I have to say, as someone who also works at the ABC, a lot of my colleagues think, and they're very genuine about this, they think that, because countries are investing heavily in wind and solar, we just have to keep building these plants until we get to net zero. But just to clarify for everyone here and those tuning in on Zoom and elsewhere, let's be clear, you need backup. And at this stage, the backup for energy for wind and solar still has to come from fossil-fired power plants, correct, Stephen?
Well, that's one way to look at it, Tom. But I think the problem with saying wind and solar is great, but we need backup, is you end up with two systems. And that's essentially, what's being proposed is a duplication of the system. In fact, if you look at the transmission plan, the official Australian government's transition plan, you look at that in dollar terms, that is proposing to more than quadruplicate the existing high voltage transmission system. So if it's the wrong way to approach building, optimizing and building an efficient power system, you need to ask, what is the optimum mix of generation and resources on that system? And when you stand back, take a deep breath, calm down and ask the question that way, you find that the optimum level of wind and solar in the system is nothing like 100%. It's nothing like 80-something%. It's kind of around the level we're at now, wind and solar about 25%, and a mix of other things. And so that includes if you're trying to get to a low or no CO2 emission system in the long run.
Yeah, but what happens, I know this term has been used a lot in the current debate, but when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, where do you get the electricity from? Felicity?
Yeah, I think I'm tripping over myself a bit because I keep wanting to come back to these guys' points,
sure.
but I won't do that. To Stephen's point, if we should have moved a lot faster, a lot earlier, shouldn't we? And perhaps we had some vested interest standing in the way of doing that. And in terms of optimisation, I think we are going to need a lot more transmission, but decentralised energy also has a whole lot of advantages in terms of not having, our model is very much about, a great big sort of centres like the Hunter, with big spokes. But, part of our transition challenge is we've got to have a lot more, there's going to be a lot more all over the place. What happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine? There's a bunch of things to talk about here. First of all, and the good thing about being in Australia, and we've got a national energy market, so there's a lot of geography. So the wind blows most of the time, actually, somewhere in Australia. And the other thing important to note is that our biggest demand is actually when the sun's out, which is when, during the day, when business and so on is operating. But I will quote Minister Bowen, who is very fond of pointing out that it doesn't rain all the time, and yet we still get water out of our taps. Storage is possible. And this is, again, it's technological. This sort of idea that, this is an impossible problem. It's a very strange, so often it's people who deeply believe in technology who go, we'll never be able to get this technology to store things properly. It's kind of a bit mad. But, batteries are improving all the time. They're going in at a huge rate. Home batteries will come down in price. There's going to, we have these other technologies which we'll talk about later which provide storage. But to Stephen's point, which is, I can just say Stephen's point about anyone, the big challenge is actually the transmission. And both the CFC and AEMO have been out in recent weeks saying we're not going fast enough. I think it was CFC said we probably need a kind of pretty large 300 megawatt wind farm a month to hit our targets. But the constraint is the transmission.
But going fast enough, Stephen Galilee, doesn't that mean we need a technological innovation here? And this is Dr. Brian Leyland. He's a power systems engineer from England with 6 decades of experience on projects around the world. Quote, barring some sort of miracle, technological breakthrough, there is no possibility that a suitable storage technology will be developed in the needed time frame. And to clarify his argument, he's saying that wind and solar power need to be backed up close to 100% by some other means of power generation. If that backup is provided by open cycle gas or worse coal, this is his argument, net zero will never be achieved. Not anything close to it. Stephen?
Well, there have been vested interests in the energy policy space for a long time, and there continues to be many billionaires involved in various projects as well. So,
I'm not arguing that we don't have lots of vested interests.
What is holding this back is the technology. Felicity is right. We didn't solve the problems of now with the technology of 30 years ago, or we wouldn't have had the internet or email, or we'd still be sending faxes to each other to communicate today. And we don't need to solve the problems of 2050 with the technology of today. And technology is evolving. All those battery storage technologies and the different types of technology that's being deployed in solar panels and those sorts of things, that is coming along, right? But there is going to need a technological breakthrough to power this transition and get those targets that the governments have signed up to. There is technology that is available right now that is not being deployed, which could help. And the two that spring to mind in relation to our national energy policy arrangements is nuclear, of course, and you probably have a bit to say about that.
We'll get to that in a moment.
But also carbon capture, utilisation and storage, which people have different views about whether or not it would work or otherwise. But if we had to put a fraction of the investment into that technology that we've put into renewable technology investment over the past two decades, we'd be more along the pathway of being able to deploy carbon capture, utilisation and storage projects at scale. I mean, it's happening in other places around the world. It might not necessarily be suitable for everywhere, but when the International Energy Agency itself says that without this technology we're not going to hit our net zero targets, then there is at least some merit in having a look at what we can do to speed that up too. And in terms of the backup technology, there are many different options. I mean, we've got pumped hydro, we've got batteries, and all those other things, as well as the traditional backup technologies. And the Finn review again is right. We shouldn't be ruling any of those out, even if we need some of them as an interim measure as we get through the transition at this very difficult stage that we're at.
So the alternatives on the energy storage are obviously nuclear. We'll get to that in a moment. Carbon capture and storage. What about the issue that Stephen just raised briefly about the hydro pumped storage? Feasible?
Yeah, look, I'm actually quite a fan of pumped hydro. Pumped hydro is...
so just clarify what it is.
Yeah. It's a technology where instead of, not a huge fan of the number of rivers we've kind of buggered up their ecology with dams, but pumped hydro uses a different technology where you build a reservoir at the top of a hill and you build a reservoir at the bottom of the hill. You put two pipes either way, up and down, and when the sun is shining, you pump the water from the bottom of the hill to the top, and then when it's at night time or whenever you need the power, you just release it down the tube and run traditional water turbines. So gushing water drives the turbine and you make electricity. I think there's a lot to like about that, partly because it uses existing technology, partly because it uses existing skills. I think the challenge, and there's really interesting stuff going on in Queensland, they're actually using a mine void in Kidston. They're putting using the drop that has been left by a coal hole to make that technology work. I think it's interesting though, in New South Wales there has been just the first auction on storage, which is set up by Matt Keane, and it's interesting that batteries did beat pumped hydro in terms of cost, probably because they are big complicated engineering tasks. So, but I think pumped hydro will be an important part of the story, but it will be a mix.
Can I just put a counter argument to you? The aforementioned Professor Leyland says it's true that many pump systems have been built in China, Japan, and the United States. but they have storage sufficient for only 6 to 10 hours operation. And he goes on to say that's tiny compared with several days storage that is needed to back up wind and solar power through routine sunless calm periods. How would you respond to Professor Leyland?
Well, I reckon Professor Leyland may have an argument in Europe, but he doesn't have one in Australia. We've got the best sun on the planet and some of the best wind. And I think it's also, I think that's, we're going to need we are going to need a bunch of things.
Carbon capture and storage, Stephen Wilson.
Carbon capture and storage is the net in net zero. So if you are trying to get to net zero, you will find there are some emissions that cannot be avoided. To neutralise those, you need so-called negative emissions. So you need to be, in that world, you're pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it away in rocks. So anyone who says to you that they believe in net zero and that they do not believe in carbon capture and storage doesn't know what they're talking about. This is a very important point. It's not a magic bullet. We've got to get away from magic bullet thinking. There are many different technologies that are going to be required. And if we want to go to this kind of extent, we will need CCS.
And is there a technology, Stephen Galilee, that can provide large-scale, low-cost CCS?
Well, the technology is available. It's just not being deployed at scale yet. There are different projects around the world where it's happening. But the bottom line on all this, pumped hydro, yes, it does have some amazing potential, and there are several different pumped hydro proposals here in New South Wales at former mine sites in much the same way that Felicity has discussed. Try getting it approved. Try getting it through the planning system in New South Wales. There's going to need to be some serious changes to the planning rules for all of these things to enable them to get approved in the time frame that is needed to get them developed. We're talking about big, large-scale projects. They'll go through the same planning approvals nightmares that the transmission lines are going through, even with the truncated planning system rules that apply for some of those projects. So, there are some broader issues here other than just the technology that's available, and it's something that governments are going to need to address if they're serious about making these things happen.
Now, some scholars, Felicity, like Michael Schellenberger, Professor Tom Wigley from the University of Adelaide, the late James Lovelock, they talk about nuclear energy, and they say this is a technology that can provide cheap and reliable supply of low emissions electricity, safe and reliable. Felicity.
Safe and reliable. Well, I guess, you don't have to start listing some of the worst accidents in the history of the planet, really, Chernobyl, Fukushima and so on. I think there's 3 reasons why nukes isn't an option or isn't really something Australia should be looking at. First of all is cost. It's really expensive. CSIRO Gen Cost, their best estimates is levelised cost of energy, including storage for solar and wind, is about 83 per megawatt hour, and for a small modular reactor is somewhere between 130 and 311. Then the speed of getting these things built. There is no, Australia, can't build a submarine, let alone a nuclear reactor. So, we don't have the skills or the depth of experience, I don't think, to make that really viable quickly. And of course, finally, I think it's just danger. The fact that it creates a really, really dangerous byproduct is deeply disturbing for across the community. And I guess I always argue the simplest way to resolve this issue is go mayor to mayor across the country and see which one of them wants one of these in their communities.
It is quite striking, Stephen Wilson, that there are some prominent left-wing advocates of nuclear energy, and I think of George Monbiot from The Guardian. Felicity mentioned Fukushima in Japan in 2011. But tell us the story about George Monbiot and his views about that tragedy.
Yeah. So I often ask young people how many people died at Fukushima due to the problem with the nuclear power plant, and they sort of scratch their head a bit and they go, I don't know, it was thousands or tens of thousands, wasn't it? And the actual number was 0. Or there's a debate whether it was 0 or 1. There was an elderly gentleman who I believe had cancer and put himself sort of sacrificially in a dangerous position. So basically no one died at Fukushima, and George Monbiot very soon after that came to the same view I came to, but it took me about 3 months. Within a couple of weeks, he published a piece in The Guardian that said that was headlined "Why Fukushima Made Me Stop Worrying and Love Nuclear Energy." It's a remarkable article, and I think that's what Fukushima actually teaches us. We understand the problem that happened there. It was a design problem. They had the backup generators in the basement because it was a photocopy of a plant from Tornado Alley in the United States. The Japanese engineers knew that those diesel backup generators should have been on the top of the hill, but in the 60s they didn't have what was needed to convince the American engineers to make that design change, and maybe a change to the contract. So no one died at Fukushima. Nearly 20,000 died because of the tsunami, including a cousin of a friend of mine. And no one died at 3 Mile Island. No one even got a scratch at 3 Mile Island either, by the way. So the only real civilian nuclear energy plant disaster that killed people was Chernobyl.
Right.
And the numbers there are much smaller.
1986, yeah.
86, yeah.
Stephen Galilee, if we had nuclear backup for wind and solar, we wouldn't need wind and solar plants, presumably.
Coal plants.
Well, I'm thinking of the backup for wind and solar.
Well, the government's making us sell coal to the generators at a loss anyway, so there's no profit in it.
What are your thoughts
for our
on
producers. It has to be on the table. I mean, there's obviously some issues with it, but the cost issue. It's expensive. Firstly, the levelised cost is the comparison that is trotted out to justify how cheap renewable energy is. It doesn't include the transmission costs, for example, right? So there's an additional cost that needs to be taken into account. I mean, how much are we spending on transmission lines, on wind and solar and all these other things? How many billions and billions and billions have we spent? Now, I'm not saying that all that spending shouldn't have happened, but for the proponents of those sorts of energy sources to turn around and say, nuclear is too expensive. I mean, come on. Really? I mean, we're spending so much money on this stuff. Can't we spend a little bit on this stuff? So I think the cost issue is...
We have a vast reserve of uranium.
And we do,
yeah.
But the laws in this country say, for example, here in New South Wales, you can explore for uranium, but if you find it, you can't mine it. So who's going to explore for it, even though we know we've got uranium reserves here? And that's another law that was brought in on the back of the Chernobyl disaster. So these things need to be on the table. And they need to be considered, and they need to be assessed on their merits in a cool and logical way, rather than just simply ruled out on the basis of some emotive arguments that are brought forward. And there's always political reasons involved, and they're going to be local concerns that need to be overcome in relation to where these things will be placed, just as there are in relation to any other major development that occurs, whether it be in the energy space or anywhere else. Go out to Muswellbrook and talk to them about where their bypass is going to be, or Singleton, where they're as much concerned about where the road is going to go as they are about where the next big project is going to be, and that's the nature of these local projects, and it would be no different for a nuclear plant too.
Okay, so let's bring this back to the subject of what all this means, this energy transition for Australia. Stephen Wilson, as you well know, a reliable fossil fuel power generation that has given us in Australia a comparative advantage against the rest of the world. Where do you see this playing out?
This is a very serious issue. We've had highly competitive, reliable energy supply in this country for all of our lifetimes, which has helped to offset our disadvantages of being so far from the rest of the world and our export markets. And we're in the process of trashing that, of throwing that in the bin. And when you stand back and look at the official proposed plan that's being implemented, and we're told to rush ahead with this thing, I think that is going to be a perpetual recession machine. That's what I think that actually is. That's a pretty serious thing to say. And so I think we need to actually stop rushing, take a deep breath, and really think about what we're doing.
The Labor government has no qualms with, on the one hand, decarbonising the economy at home, which of course reflects their commitments to net zero emissions by 2050. But of course, it has no qualms in exporting coal and gas and uranium abroad. Felicity, all that money is being used to pay down the deficit, finance Labor's pet projects like the NDIS and Gonski schools. So the question here is, in a net zero world, how will Australia have a competitive advantage in the world when we eventually get rid of these minerals?
And I think that's a really important question. And I'm not denying that we have got very wealthy on the back of these resources and exporting them to the world. And, that is a political, in terms of this transition and our need to get off fossil fuels as a globe, that is a key political barrier. However, of course, the important story is that Australia has had this huge competitive advantage in terms of having a whole lot of coal and gas and stuff to dig up. We also have a huge competitive advantage in having the best sun and wind resources in the world. So there is no reason why we can't carry our competitive advantage in cheap energy across to the new system. And with that, then the question becomes, how do we maximise that? How do we get past what we've done with our resource capacity and just focused on digging stuff up, being, a fairly kind of, what do they say? We're just behind Laos in terms of the complexity of our economy. But actually harness the fact that we have all of that, we're going to have cheap power, and start looking particularly at our resources and making sure that we are part of value adding, processing our bauxite more, processing our lithium and so on, get further up the value chain and, using our cheap power to make really valuable things to ship
And
off.
does the drive for this energy transition, Stephen Galilee, increase demand for minerals like lithium many times over? And as the net zero emission campaign intensifies, how difficult will it be to source this huge increase in minerals?
Well, I represent the resources sector more broadly. So we represent, obviously the coal producers, but also the metals and minerals producers in New South Wales. And this is a very big, significant growing opportunity for that part of the sector. And it's called renewable energy, but what you need to make renewable energy work is finite. It's what comes out of the ground. It's the nickel, the cobalt, the lithium, and all those other things that you mentioned. Now, there is a massive opportunity for Australia in that respect, notwithstanding, that we're apparently a backwater economy. There is significant technological work being done, and visit any mine and you'll see it right now in relation to the innovation that's going on. Copper is a great example. There is a huge shortage of copper coming globally. There already is. Australia has about 6% of the world.
6% of the world's copper.
We're the fifth largest copper.
Well, hang on. Let's put this in context. I got here from the Wall Street Journal about 60% of the world's lithium is processed in China. Nearly 50% of copper is smelted there.
Yeah, now lithium is a great example.
China.
Let's look at lithium and copper right now. So Australia we're the third largest supplier of lithium after Peru and Chile. Now that's copper. We supply only 4% of the world's copper, yet we have some of the biggest resources. Lithium is a different story. We have some of the world's biggest lithium resources, and we supply almost up to 50% of the world's lithium, and most of it goes to China. We supply 75% of China's lithium. So there's a reason why the government is working at state and federal level, and most of the lithium is not in New South Wales, it's in WA and Queensland, to broaden the lithium processing capabilities of this country, because at the moment almost all of it goes to China and almost all of it is processed there. That's why we see these $100 million or more interest-free loans going to develop those. Now that's not just for renewable energy, and I saw Kim Beazley had a paper on this today. All these metals and minerals for the future that are touted as needed for renewable energy, they're also needed for other things too. They're needed for the technology that we use every day. They're also needed for the innovations and the technology and all those things that are used for the military needs of ourselves and our alliance partners, and it's becoming more and more about national security as much as anything else, which is why governments are moving into this space. Copper is another story. We're not maximising our opportunities in relation to copper. We've got some of the world's biggest copper resources. We're only supplying about 4% of the world's copper. We've got so much copper under the ground here in New South Wales and more broadly across the country. And there's a big opportunity there. Now, that's before you even start talking about the nickel and the cobalt that are needed for batteries and other things, before you start talking about the mineral sands and the rare earths that are needed for the advanced technology that our national security alliance partners are desperate for us to develop, because at the moment, most of this stuff is coming out of China and other places where we might not necessarily be able to get it in the future. So it's not just a renewable energy story in relation to those metals and minerals, it's a national security story.
What about the
too.
big picture issue about these UN climate conferences and had Glasgow 2 years ago? They're not legally binding, verifiable and enforceable, but there's a lot of media hoopla about the significance of these conferences, mainly because countries are saying they're committed to reducing their emissions. But how do we in Australia, I think we account for something like 1.4% of global emissions, how can we play a meaningful role, and the West generally? The West is decarbonising their economies, but the non-OECD, led by China and India, their carbon emissions are steadily escalating. So how can we reduce the global greenhouse gas emissions when the non-OECD continues to chug along the smoky path to prosperity? Stephen?
Well, CO2 is not smoky, but we're breathing it out. But yeah, so I think that's a great question, Tom. The question is, what can we do in Australia, given that in the scheme of the world, our 25 million population is a very tiny fraction of the 8 billion population, and same on emissions. And I think that's a question we've not thought intelligently enough about. I think if we rush unintelligently to net zero in a very self-sacrificing way, the result will be that people in India and China, Southeast Asia, other countries will look at our example and say, let's not follow that example. So what we need to do, we are wealthy, largely a middle-class society. We can't just be coming up with solutions for rich people. We need to have highly affordable solutions that are going to work in low and middle income countries. And that's going to take a lot of intelligent thought, so that then people will see our example and think, wow, that's the kind of example we want to follow.
And let's look at China just briefly. It approved its largest expansion of coal-fired power plants last year. It's the largest expansion of coal-fired power plants since 2015. China is now the world's largest producer of carbon emissions. Now, it is true that China is also a trendsetter on solar panels and renewable technologies and batteries. But does that mean, Felicity, that there's a danger here that in our attempts to reduce global emissions, we might be increasingly more dependent on China, especially at the time when US-China great power competition is intensifying?
Yeah, well, I don't think we can blame we can't blame the organised, centralised economy for being better at getting on with new trends than capitalism's turned out to be. It's hardly an argument. And this story is really, it's a very well-known story that most of that solar technology that China is building and making billions and billions of dollars out of was developed at UNSW, and Australia did not have the wit to hold that manufacturing capacity here. So that's, I think that's depressing, but
is there a danger we could become dependent on China for these renewables and batteries and solar panels?
I think that's a real challenge to us, and it goes back to what I was talking about before, which is Ross Garnaut's kind of thesis, that we're going to have cheap power. We've really got to get our act together to work out how we maximise our role in that global change. And I think it's not only China that's important here, but of course Biden has passed the Inflation Reduction Act, where he's putting $369 billion into a bunch of things, but largely about supporting manufacturing of clean energy infrastructure in America. And most of you will have heard Twiggy Forrest saying there's no reason why you'd be investing here when you can go and invest there and get a whole lot of subsidy. So as a country, we've got a challenge. Are we going to use our advantages and become part of the solution, or are we going to let other smarter countries take the opportunity?
I sat in a presentation in Dubbo a few weeks ago, and there was a lovely lady giving the presentation from Electrify Australia about all the good things that can be done to transform our households into electric households based on renewable energy. And in theory, it sounded great. But the answer to everything that she wanted done was more government subsidies. The answer is not government subsidies for everything, right? There's a reason why the US is, trillions and trillions of dollars in debt because of those sorts of things that are being done over there. And we can't follow that path either. We can't go down that path either. That is a permanent recession waiting to happen.
Well, so the question I ask is what's the difference? Does anyone know this? What's the difference between a good subsidy and a bad subsidy?
Twiggy Forrest
The good
knows.
subsidy's the one you get, the bad subsidy one you pay.
Exactly. I first asked this in 2016 at the Engineers Conference, and I got blank stares. I asked it the other week in the Senate committee, and they all chuckled. So people are getting the message.
Okay, now it's time for Q&A, and our first question comes from, just ask Seg. Yeah, Gordon.
Fascinating talk. Maybe the thing I've got is, I'm an optimist in the sense that I think we could achieve net zero by 2050, but it's going to be at a very high cost. And I think, and maybe seeking comments from the panel, that I think what we're lacking is the honest engagement with Australian society, in fact global society, about how much it will actually cost. Because what we're led to believe broadly is all of this is going to happen, everything's going to be cheaper. But I think, picking up on all of the comments today and outside of this room as well, it's not going to be cheap, it's going to cost, but we're not having that honest debate.
Yeah. So the process of decarbonising the economy is not a cost-free exercise.
Can I absolutely. I mean, we have been sold a pup on this for so many years by too many politicians over-promising and under-delivering on this stuff. Too many politicians that have been prepared to stand in front and cut ribbons in front of projects and turn sods, promise us the world and not be upfront about how much this is going to cost and how much disruption it is going to take. And that is why the reckoning is happening. I mean, I hope that Bowen and Keane are around in time to admit that they've got it wrong on some of this stuff. I mean, can you imagine two worse people in charge of this energy transition than Bowen and Keane?
So just to be clarified,
Absolutely.
Chris Bowen is the Federal Energy Minister, and Matt Keane
and both
was
of them are great at factional politics.
the New South Wales Treasurer last government. Yep.
Factional politics, but not much else. So I mean, if there's any journalists in the room, I hope your pens are ready.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, look, I think the debate is about economics and engineering, and I don't see a lot of that from either the two aforementioned ministers that you talk about, and it goes to thermodynamics, which is why hydrogen doesn't work, and it doesn't work economically, but I guess the leaving aside Felicity's worries about the safety of nuclear energy, which I don't accept, and I note the 50-year history of the Southern Shire was called From Sails to Atoms because in 1956 they were very proud of their new nuclear power station, nuclear reactor, not a power station, and there was. And obviously ANSTO has gone on for another few years. But whenever I raise the debate about nuclear, I always get answers similar to that. I'll look at the CSIRO report, which, if you actually read it, is actually a load of crock when it comes to nuclear. There's not time. It costs too much. But if you look at the UAE example of getting the Koreans in and just saying, just build it, it's possible. And I did the numbers the other day on the hydro that Queensland's talking about, and there's not much difference in cost between the nuclear power plant and the Queensland hydro. What does the panel think about if we say we'll push 80% back to 2040? Can we design a better, cheaper system and then spend the money on NDIS and other useful things?
Can I respond on the cost issue? I think there's a couple of things that are really important to point out here. Those coal-fired power stations aren't shutting down because the evil Matt Keane and Chris Bowen are going in and shutting them down. They are shutting down because boardrooms are making decisions about their ability to compete. So, let's
ESG.
And ESG, well, a little bit, but also the fact that they're also getting very old. So this idea that that this legacy thing is free, most of these places are now very dangerous and need to be fixed. So let's be clear about that. And the other thing an obvious point to make too is it's actually the jurisdictions where there's most renewable penetration where the wholesale cost of electricity is lowest. Last quarter, wholesale electricity prices in Victoria, which has the most lot of renewables, was $64 a megawatt hour, as opposed to $114 in Queensland, where they still rely on coal and gas. So this idea that somehow that there was a cheap, happy system going along and it was going to keep going, and then these evil renewables had come in and made a huge problem, not forgetting that gas is actually the key driver of one of the key drivers of the electricity price increases, that's a fantasy. And I know that this is a world where we all talk in our we all live in our little worlds and argue our little worlds. And I couldn't agree more that we now have a whole bunch of rent seekers who are called renewable energy operators that are the same as coal operators. You know, this isn't hippie stuff anymore. This is serious big capital, you know, who are interested in making a buck. But we need to be we need to not be sloppy in terms of these things. And, you know, it's hard. I accept so much of what you've said. But, yeah, the cost argument is tricky.
Felicity, there's more to the coal plant closure story than that simple idea that coal plants are no longer cost competitive. There's a paradox. The paradox is that if you're sitting in a boardroom, if you're the owner of a coal plant, you're sitting in the boardroom, and the dispatch pattern of the coal plant is having big bites taken out of it by midday solar and random bites taken out of it by wind, then that is reducing your revenue line, and it's driving up your operation and maintenance costs, and it's driving down the efficiency of the plant, and it's shortening its life, and it's making it financially very difficult to keep that plant open. That's what happened to Northern in South Australia. That's what was happening to Hazelwood in Victoria.
Isn't that what markets and innovation do?
So there's a problem here. So we need to distinguish between markets and the physical system, right? This is extremely important. So there was naivety in the 1990s when we did the market reforms and the liberalisation and the competition. The problem is, the paradox is that the physical system, the whole power system, still needs those assets, but from a sort of selfish profit-making asset owner point of view, they don't make sense. That this is a real problem, and so like if you're a green. If you know, I'm not saying you're like this, Felicity, but if I was a green activist, let's say I was a Marxist and I wanted to destroy the electricity market, and let's say I actually also wanted to destroy the Australian economy, one of the best ways to do that would be doing exactly what we're doing to the power system.
And they've been excluded from the dispatchable power options as well. So, and look, no one is saying here that renewable energy is evil. Right? No one is saying that. Well, I'm certainly not saying that. I don't think you are either. I mean, it's just that every energy source has its advantages and disadvantages, and they need to be assessed on their merits, on the balance of what is needed. So, you know, there is, but you can't possibly argue that that political decisions have not been taken to encourage the early closure of coal-fired power stations before replaceable energy is going to be ready. That is why Eraring, hopefully, and I'm sure it will happen, will be extended beyond 2025, simply because it's going to have to. I mean, no responsible government is going to say, yeah, shut it down, and we'll roll the dice and make sure that, you know, we'll see what happens, and there's an election coming up. That's why, you know, the Premier, new Premier Chris Minns has been, you know, far more realistic and responsible on these issues than Matt Keane was, and because they know they've got a responsibility to keep the lights on for as long as possible, while also doing all the things they're going to need to do to get their renewable energy zones ready, to get the wind and solar, you know, installed in time. But there is no question this whole transition is going to have to slow down because reality is here.
Felicity.
I guess it probably won't come as a surprise to you that I agree that it would have been a much better way to do the transition to keep the electricity system in public ownership.
I agree with that. I totally agree with that.
That NEM, the energy market was created assuming that the world was going to go on as it was forever, and of course there's a huge moment of destruction and you know, change, and the market has not been equipped at all to make rational decisions in this process, and that is at the detriment to all of us.
Rafe Champion.
Thanks, Tom. Well, my next book will be How Wind Droughts Destroyed Western Civilization. Now, Felicity, I want to ask you, in the light of the evidence coming out from the AEMO records on the supply of wind power, given that those records unequivocally show lengthy periods up to 3 days in duration, 3 days and nights, across the whole of the NEM, with no useful wind power, in the light of that evidence, what database are you drawing on to say that we've got world-class wind resources that are going to see us home and dry on the back of wind and solar power?
A couple of things. I think we do have great wind power. We have great solar, so we will have a lot of supply across most of the time. But I'm not suggesting that we're not going to need storage too. But in terms of the battle of the analysts, there's a guy called David Osmond, an Australian energy analyst, who has modelling based on real world in terms of what's actually happening now in the system, and reckons that we can probably get to about 98% with solar and wind without storage. I'm not backing him, but I'm just pointing out that we don't quite know how all of that's going to add up when we build this out properly. And, we've got a lot of barriers to pass. And, I want to back Stephen too on the challenges of doing the transmission lines, which is essential to the next step, because I'm also worried about the biodiversity. I don't want transmission lines destroying the forests any more than I want coal mines destroying the forests.
What about a massive solar farm in the middle of Central Australia that's going to destroy biodiversity to export power to Singapore? That's an environmental abomination, surely.
I think, we have got a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis, and we have to manage for both, and that's challenging. And, this is big, fat industrial stuff, and that has implications.
Janet Barlow.
Wouldn't the Australian environment and humans here be far better off if we had never started on this transition, if we had just built a new Healy coal-fired power station in the Hunter Valley with all the transmission lines in place, and then Perpetual have put out a report saying that per kilowatt hour, the renewable energy requires 10 to 15 times more metals than carbon or nuclear power. So when you think of the $7 billion a year in subsidies for wind and solar, not mentioning the subsidies for all these transmission lines, the fact that all this stuff we're importing from China has to be taken down every 20, 25 years, and heaven knows what we're going to do with it. And all the metals required, the land required, the money required. The other Perpetual are also saying it's $1 trillion per 1% of this transmission. And the fact that coal and gas within them have enormous stores of energy that have taken billions of people out of poverty. So do you really, Felicity, believe that we have improved the Australian environment, improved the Australian air by doing what we're doing and what we have done?
I guess it just fundamentally comes down to whether what you think about climate change, doesn't it? That debate. That the UNFCCC, most countries in the world have signed up to a document that says we need to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, and that warming is happening, that those fires, the intensity, the rapidity of them, the floods, that there is something going wrong in the climate. And unless you, I guess, accept that fundamental global consensus, then of course we should just keep pumping out coal and gas and hope that everyone else, all the other countries that have signed up to the convention, don't do anything about it, so they keep buying this stuff even though it should, by the logic of the convention, become less and less valuable. I can't argue if you don't believe in climate change.
And on that note, I just thought I'd read out something from the Washington Post. At the end of the Glasgow Climate Summit, so this was in late 2021, more than 90% of the global economy was covered by net zero targets. However, an international team of scientists writing for Science Journal that has ranked 90% of countries' net zero plans as having low confidence of being achieved. I mean, that is striking. Next question.
Thanks, Tom. Felicity, first off, just want to acknowledge and pay respect to your attendance, and it's very important that we actually have a genuine debate with a range of views, and I think you've been doing a great job this afternoon. My question to you, however, is one around you've acknowledged yourself the importance of we need to expand mining, we need to expand minerals processing in Australia rather than shipping to China, and that is a fundamentally dirty process. Millions of gallons of acid leaching, for example, in some of those processes. We need to greatly expand industrial activity in our offshore marine environments. Do you and the Labor Climate Action Network believe we can achieve that in the timeframes that the transition calls for, while maintaining our current environmental biodiversity, the EPBC Act, processes and requirements? Or, being honest, as was said before, are we going to need to make a trade-off and say we're going to have to give up some of those standards in order to get this stuff built quick enough?
Look, I think that does hit on one of the key debates that's going to come our way, and one of the key, I think probably on my side of the debate, it's going to be a fantastic wedge. People who say, and I said this before, we actually have a biodiversity crisis that actually, is pretty life-threatening in the long run too, when all the pollinators die and so on and so forth. But we've also got a climate change crisis. And, you'll already hear this from the government that, as we the EPBC, the environmental law reform that's going on federally, has to do this joint thing of, it's promised to do this thing of making it simpler for business as well as making it better for the environment. Now, there's a challenge. And I don't think any of us, and, it's very strong in the movement, that I am part of, where people are saying we need to be building this stuff faster. And I'm one of those people saying, but not at the expense of proper planning. So, there's a balance to be had in all of those things, and I totally agree with you. I'm terrified of what clean energy might do to some really important biodiversity hotspots, and we're going to have to manage that.
Fred, last question.
Yeah, thank you all. I wanted to raise the question of education of the population. Even Minister Bowen, publicly in these sort of fora, says we need gas for transition, and yet the average person in the population, the voters are saying, the children are saying, because they're taught in schools, coal is bad, all coal is bad, including steel coal, and all gas is bad. And because of that, gas projects are not being approved. We desperately need more gas projects to get that transition fuel through the period. And what are we doing about all the things that you guys have been talking about need to be understood by the general population. The high cost of transition, the need perhaps to slow down so we don't have blackouts. There doesn't seem to be anything going through in terms of education on the media and everything else to the general population to change their minds about this. Thank you.
Well, perhaps I could answer that by saying that next week we at CIS are going to publish a major report on the attitudes of the Gen Z and millennial Australians, and dealing with the question of intergenerational inequality. And what do you think of the cause of this crisis is? The cold hard reality is that younger generations of Australians look at the world through a different prism than, say, you and me, Fred, and I suspect the majority of people in this room. And they do take climate change exceedingly seriously. And that's probably in part because they've grown up in an environment at school where they're taught about the catastrophic consequences of carbon dioxide. But it's also they feel that, for better or for worse, right or wrong, that they're going to live in a world that could be catastrophic. So these are widespread perceptions, and trying to change those attitudes, it's a very difficult process. And it's not just to deal with climate change, it's also dealing with issues like housing affordability, a perception that inequality is rampant in the Western world, including in Australia. And as the Productivity Commission showed a few years ago, we've experienced a boom 30-year run until COVID with little great widening in inequality. So Matt Taylor, who's written the report, will deal with some of these issues. And I think on that note, it's a good way to conclude. We've probably gone over time, but look, as I said in my introduction, we at CIS really haven't been that engaged in the climate and energy debates mainly because it's a real niche issue. And we've tried to make amends today by having a terrific panel here today. Please join me in thanking our panellists, Felicity, Stephen and Stephen. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.